Hello and welcome. Today we are going to be looking at some good picks in each class for Tier 6 ranked battles. The upcoming season of Ranked is being played at single tiers, Bronze being Tier 6, Silver at Tier 8 and Gold at Tier 10. Today we're going to be looking at Bronze, and the thing that makes this season much different to others is the addition of submarines. So capabilities for tackling them is something we'll be taking into consideration for our picks. If there are any ships you really like and don't see them in this video, then feel free to let people know in the comments below. We'll start this video off by looking at destroyers. This class is arguably one of the most influential in games, as when captained by a skilled player, can make a real impact. Now, what we'll be looking for from ships in this class is they'll need to have either some of the best torpedoes, guns, or a nice combination of the two. Plus, we'll also want to take good depth charge capabilities into consideration. Starting this list off, we have the British destroyer Icarus. The first reason why it's in this list is because, if you've not yet seen, British destroyers have some of the best anti-submarine weaponry in the game. Icarus is no exception. It has a depth charge rating of 46, which is the best at its tier for tech tree line ships, closely followed by the US Farragut with 42. If you purely wanted to sink submarines in a destroyer, then you would definitely have the most luck when captaining this ship. If you are not too bothered about knocking out submarines, then it does have many good attributes too. The guns are good, as you have got 4 120mm guns that can fire every 5 seconds. Plus, with the new commander skill changes, if the 11.6km range is a little too limiting for you, then you can pick the main battery and AA expert skill, which will increase the range by 15%. As well as this, you'll also get an increased flak damage, so that's going to improve your fairly bad anti-air. Now, as well as this, you can also choose the main battery and AA specialist, because this will also reduce your reload by 5% and give you a 10% AA damage bonus still, which is going to make playing this ship even more enjoyable. Now, the torpedoes are decent too. If you have got a 10-point commander using Concealment Expert, then you can give yourself a 1km radius to Stealth Torp. So this will be most useful when you're kiting a flank, but do be warned they are a little slow at 59 knots. Although the anti-air isn't the best, as already mentioned, Icarus has something the British destroyer line is known for: fast action smokes. If you are unlucky and get a carrier hunting you down, you have quick reloading fast action smoke screens, meaning you can regularly get into cover if needed. You also have a hydroacoustic search, which will be good if you are being pursued by a destroyer that's trying to flush you out of a smoke, giving you adequate warning of them or their torpedoes. Now, there's also the premium option of Gallant. However, I can't speak for its anti-submarine capabilities, since it wasn't available to play on the public test server, but I'll take a guess and say it'll have a similar value. Next on the list of destroyers, we have Hitler's favourite bath toy, T-61. This ship, I think almost everyone can agree, is borderline overpowered, which when on a level playing field, such as this ranked season, T-61 can cause total havoc. Overall, it's a very versatile ship with a mighty punch. The main reason for why it's so powerful is certainly the torpedo armament. The range can sometimes cause limitations, but the stats you can get with them are what make them so good. If you were to fully spec your captain for them, you can fire them off every 61 seconds, they'll travel at a blistering 72 knots, and have an amazing chance to flood. Now, because you have 2 quad launchers, being able to fire off that regularly will mean, especially when you're being chased off a flank, you can do tremendous damage and have a massive impact on your games. Conversely, the guns on T-61 aren't amazing, but since you will be spending most of your time using torpedoes, they just add a nice extra to your damage whilst you are waiting for your torpedoes to reload, and as well as that, you may set some fires if you do get lucky. In terms of dealing with other destroyers, this is where you can use your tactical advantage of having German hydro. In an offensive manner, you can flush out smokes, and if there are no enemies around to spot when you fire, you can just blast them out of their smoke, and once they do spot you, you should already be close to knocking them out anyway. Now, if they do manage to spot you earlier, let's say there's a friendly ship on their team which spots you whilst you're shooting them in their smoke, your ship does have a solid amount of HP, which will still really help in these engagements. Now, using hydro in a defensive manner, it would be a very similar application. However, it would instead involve you being in the smoke and using the hydro there. Then once they do come into range whilst they're chasing you, you can shoot them from your smoke whilst not getting spotted if they're not close enough, and then you can pretty much turn the tables of the engagement. Now finally, when you are dealing with torpedo armed tin cans, if the stats are similar to Gator, then your depth charges will have around about a rating of 18, so submarine hunting won't be as effective compared to other destroyers. The last destroyer we'll be looking at is Hatsuharu. This is another good tech tree pick since it's a ship that does a bit of everything, allowing you to be versatile regardless of the type of engagement. This is certainly a hybrid ship, but it does lean more towards being a torpedo boat. This is because most of the torpedo stats are really good, such as a 76-second reload. The torpedoes are good, since they've got a great range of 10 km, and when spec'd for speed using the Swift Fish skill and the Torpedo Tubes modification 1, you can get the speed up to 65 knots, which will be harder to avoid than 59. Staying on the topic of torpedoes, because the range is so good, it'll mean you can easily knock out targets without needing to get too close. And if you did need to get closer, when using Concealment Expert and the camo, you can reduce your detectability range down to 5.8 km, which will come in very useful at times. Now the guns are average in terms of range and reload, so they don't really win any prizes. They've got a range of 10.8 km and have a reload of 7.5 seconds, which is fairly long, and really isn't the best. However, you can improve those stats with main battery and AA expert skill, which will increase the range by 15%, plus the main battery and anti-air specialist skill, which will reduce the reload by 5%, which will just make it a bit easier, but that is granted that those skills do come onto the live server with those stats. If you do have enough points, you could also opt for Adrenaline Rush, but that really does entirely depend on how you want to play this ship. Another great thing about the ship is its speed. It has a base speed of 36.5 knots, which can be increased to 38.3 with the Sierra Mike signal, which on its own is absolutely rapid. But alongside this, you also have an engine boost consumable, giving you an 8% increase on top of that. When you activate it, that'll mean you'll be able to increase your speed up to 41.3 knots. So if you need to engage or disengage quickly, this will be a brilliant ship to do so in. Finally, having that speed will mean you'll be able to get on top of subs in no time and drop your bath bombs. Now, granted that they are shallow enough, then your depth charges should be able to blow them out of the water really easily because these have got a rating of 37, which is still pretty good. Overall, this ship is a brilliant all-rounder and will be good for players who just want a bit of everything from a destroyer whilst playing in ranked. Now, with Hatsuharu covered, that just about concludes this section and we'll move on to cruisers. Cruisers are probably the most versatile class in the game. This is due to cruiser lines varying so much, meaning there are so many playstyles you could adopt, allowing for lots of choice depending on how you like to play. One element they all share is they are there to provide support, so the things we'll be looking for is ships that have something about them that they do really well in, whether that's having a powerful main armament, thick armour or utility for example, which can provide support or do something really good. We'll start this list off with Kick Down, a ship perfectly equipped to deal with submarines, as it is the first in its line to be equipped with the airstrike consumable, which should be good at making precision drops on submarines. It also has really accurate and fast travelling shells, so if one does service within a decent range, you will be able to hurt them with high explosive too. Moving on to dealing with other ships, primarily cruisers and battleships, Kick Down is best suited to supporting from cover or kiting. This is because it's not really that good at sustaining fire unlike some more armoured cruisers because it doesn't have that much armour. So your best bet is more going to be sort of kiting away and continually chipping away at ships whilst you are sort of avoiding their shots. Now, your main choice of ammo will be high explosive, as you will want to be just, as I say, consistently chipping away at everything, and those fires will help speed up that process further. Plus, once they do get close enough, you may be able to get lucky and score some hits with your airstrike. To aid the survivability of the ship, you do also have a hydroacoustic search, which will come in very useful, especially when you have a destroyer coming in close. Now, you do also get a spotting plane too, which is going to allow you to execute long-range shots, which will really help you when kiting. As well as this, it'll just generally allow you to sort of shoot and support your team from afar. Now, overall, the ship can perform well in ranked battles, but you are going to be a little bit reliant on having ships to spot for you because you are mainly wanting to be sitting behind cover or just be really at range, which both cases you are going to need someone to be spotting for you, but apart from that, I do think it should be able to perform pretty decently. Next up on the list we have Perth. This I feel will be incredibly powerful this ranked season, since now it doesn't have to contend against tier 7 ships, and so should wreak total havoc. The reason I say this is because Perth has the perfect array of consumables to do everything it needs without needing any assistance from teammates. The beauty of the ship is firstly you have a crawling smokescreen, meaning you can provide your own moving cover, in turn allowing you to provide supporting fire to your team even out in the open. You also have a hydroacoustic search, which means whilst you're in that smoke, you can make sure you don't get caught off guard by torpedoes, or possibly a destroyer just rushing you. And finally, you have an attack aircraft, which is the key for being self-reliant. The reason that's important is because let's say your team is losing, you have no destroyer, and you need to do something to turn a game around. Due to the fighter having the ability to spot ships, you can pop a smoke, and maybe a hydro if needed, move into the open and launch your fighters. Granted you are not too close for them to be shot down, the fighters will spot any nearby ships, where you can then start burning them down without needing help from teammates, and because of your crawling smoke you can keep moving around to just really avoid any blind shots, therefore being a very scary opponent to deal with, especially if you are focusing down a slow lumbering battleship, because there is basically nothing they're going to be able to do. That capability alone is why I think Perth will be a pivotal ship in ranked. And that's not even mentioning the low detection range and great maneuverability, so definitely I think this will be a very powerful ship. Now, you will need to be cautious about any good hydro ships such as Gaspé and T61 spotting you whilst you're in your smoke, so just make sure to keep checking your map whenever you're doing this, but apart from that, if you are very mindful of your positioning, you should have some incredible fun in this ship and come out with some incredibly good scores. The next ship I can imagine is going to be rather heavily used. The ship in question, Gaspé. This is a very powerful ship, it has some great armour, which will allow for battle tanking, pretty much the same guns as Scharnhorst, so you can inflict some real damage, and some great utility in the form of consumables. The most notable consumable is certainly the hydroacoustic search. Since there is no radar at tier 6, ships with good hydro will be able to flush out any smokes. Gaspé's hydro has a ship detection range of 5.5 kilometers, which lasts just under 2 minutes without any skills or upgrades present, so you can imagine how powerful this will be. Now, let's say you are going into a smoke and you are trying to flush out a destroyer, for example. Once you have spotted that ship, your reload is 20 seconds. So once you've fired, you're going to want to make sure you do hit your shots, because otherwise you will be relying on your auxiliary armament instead. Now, the secondaries are pretty good. They reach 5.6 kilometers and you have got a good amount of them, so they will do a bit to help in terms of damage. Plus you also have 8-kilometer torpedoes too, which will be great for throwing into smokes or any strategic bottlenecks such as small passages through islands, but definitely because of that reload you will definitely want to make sure you hit your shots to at least scare that destroyer into not coming straight for you. If you do sustain a lot of damage, all is good. Unlike a good amount of other cruisers, you do have a repair party, so with the already great stats, this should help keep you in games even longer. That survivability aspect also means it's a great ship to hold good angles and keep caps in your team's control. Your bow will allow you to hold positions easily, since only some battleships will overmatch, plus the hydro will give you warning if a destroyer tries to dislodge you, and once you do lose some health, you can just stay in the position a little longer as the heal should mitigate the damage taken. Honestly, the stats speak for themselves, so if you want a pretty easy run through ranked, this will be a good pick for you. Whilst on the topic of utility ships, that brings us onto our next pick, Leander. This is another strong choice since it has access to the standard damage control party, a repair party, a hydroacoustic search and the option of smoke. Alongside those, it also has a good main battery armament of 8 152mm guns plus 2 quad single launch torpedo launchers with a range of 8 kilometers. These attributes mean that Leander can cause some serious damage without much return fire if it's safe in smoke or behind an island. However, it is still quite vulnerable because it's got some rather thin armour, which does leave it rather susceptible to getting citadeled even when slightly mispositioned. The playstyle you'll want to adopt with the Leander is that of a cautious one. Most of your time should be spent behind rocks and cover, whilst providing consistent supporting fire to your team. Your guns can easily cause a few thousand damage per salvo, so when you are in cover, you can really aid your team by wearing down your opponents. The only times you'll want to be out of cover is to reposition, pursue a lone destroyer, or be in your smoke. Any other times, you will need to make sure you are aware of your enemy's positions and who can shoot you from where, since you are an easy target to knock out. The torpedoes you'll be able to use in a similar fashion to Graf Speeds, since they have the same range, which will mean any bottlenecks you can cover in torpedoes, and occasionally you'll get some lucky hits. But the one good thing about British ones is they are single fire, so you can fire with more precision. Finally, Leander has the best depth charge rating at this tier, sitting at 42, so will be effective if it needs to use the charges. The one problem with countering submarines in cruisers is that it will be much harder, since you've got a lower speed and less agility, which will make it harder to get on top of them, so these charges will be more of a defensive measure. Overall, Leander should be a really good pick for ranked, and with some practice you'll be able to get some really good results. The last cruiser we'll look at is Le Galissonière, a ship which requires a totally different and specific playstyle to all others in this list. How it best plays is firing at targets around the extent of its range whilst simultaneously avoiding shots and getting into strategic points. The ship has 3 triple 152mm guns which can pack a hard-hitting, accurate punch, since they've got a sigma of 2 and are very accurate with 132 meters of dispersion, allowing you to get many shell hits even at range. The vertical dispersion isn't too great at 86 meters, which means if you are shooting at targets, then you should get a fairly even spread along the length of the ship for maximum effectiveness. If you find yourself close to a destroyer or the side of a cruiser, you are also equipped with a main battery reload booster, which will allow you to hurl out plenty of shots in a short period of time, meaning destroyers and unaware cruisers can be rather easy to take out. The high explosive is very good on this ship too, and should suffice when shooting at any class, as it's got 25mm of penetration and a decent fire chance, so even non-penetrations can still cause fires. Now, another interesting thing about La Galissonière is the 9km torpedo she has. You do only have 2 per side, but since you are at range anyway, you may as well fire them and see if you can get lucky. Now we'll move on to manoeuvrability. On its own, La Galissonière isn't all that speedy. It's got a surprisingly low top speed of 31 knots, so Sierra Mike is certainly a must. And as well as this, it does bleed quite a lot of speed in turns, so you will have to be careful when doing so, especially when you are closer to targets. What you will want to take advantage of is the quick reloading engine boost consumable. This will propel you to much higher speeds, which is exactly what you want when you are far away, since you can lob shots over to your targets, but because of your speed, it'll be harder for them to land any return shots. One thing I'd recommend is you equip the propulsion modification 1 in slot 4, since having fast acceleration and deceleration will make avoiding shots even easier and give you a much more enjoyable experience. Unfortunately, it doesn't come equipped with depth charges, which is quite sad since it can reach high speeds and will be able to track these targets down quickly, but if one does surface, your accurate shells should cause some damage, and really all in all, La Galissonière will give you a very different style of play in ranked, and if kiting and long range fire is something you enjoy, then this should be the ship for you. Now, speaking of enjoyment, if you're liking the content so far, then maybe consider subscribing, as it'll really help the channel out. The third class we'll be looking at is Battleships. This class will take key roles in games, as they are accountable for both delivering and absorbing the heaviest blows in battles. The main things we'll be looking for in these ships are either a powerful offensive arsenal, such as overmatching or quick reloading guns, incredibly good armour, or ideally a nice combination between the two. The first battleship we'll be looking at is West Virginia. This probably comes as no surprise to most because the main batteries are lethal. What you lack in numbers is made up by caliber. 406mm will provide you with 27mm of overmatch, making you a formidable enemy to anything with a citadel, and is a ship meeting our criteria of having good guns. Due to the guns being so good, West Virginia does suffer in many other ways, which are things you will have to get used to in return for such power. Some of the issues are as follows: a low HP pool with a poor repair party, fairly poor deck armour, which can easily be penetrated by most ships, so in a bad position can be sunk very fast from spammers, poor anti-air defense, a slow speed of 21 knots, a huge concealment range, and finally a short firing range, which makes both artillery plotting room modification 1 and the spotting aircraft essential. Now, after hearing those points, and you are still interested in playing it, then here are some tips. Because of how much penetration your shells have, any lightly armoured or even well armoured targets you'll overpenetrate when they are showing you flat sides. To take the full effect of them, what you want to do is fire at targets which are angling themselves, since at that point they'll need to get through more, causing the shells to detonate inside, causing either regular penetration damage, which on its own is great, or possibly citadel damage. As for positioning, initially you will want to have some distance between you and your targets, since it will reduce the chance of receiving any return fire, and you'll be less likely to be in range of spammers. Once you're on a flank, just make sure to be aware of what enemies are where. This is so you can think if you move into a position, can you sustain constant fire from them and possibly other ships? This is because you'd rather not get into those situations as your top speed is so low, so then getting out of that position when things get too hot will take a while and could possibly be too late and you get knocked out. Apart from that, just focus on strategic targets causing the biggest issues for your team and trying to stay alive. I mean, that is pretty sage advice for any ship, but just try and keep this in mind whilst you're playing in West Virginia. Ismail is another ship that should be quite fun to play in ranked, as I think it will be somewhat of a similar experience to how Sinop has performed in Tier 7 Bronze, which is rather well. Don't get me wrong, Ismail has got its flaws, but they are things that you can easily deal with whilst having fun with what the ship can offer. Starting off with the guns, although you do only get 19mm of overmatch due to them being under the 358mm threshold, they can still throw some heavy punches as you have got 12 guns. They should be able to make short work of any side or just about anything that's badly angled through quantity alone. If you are facing ships that are angling, you do have something to combat this: great high explosive. For setting fires, your first thought would be to turn to the British. The beautiful thing about Ismail is the high explosive has got a higher fire chance than Queen Elizabeth, sitting at a remarkable 38% without modifiers. So if you are facing a ship that won't expose themselves, you can just load HE and burn them down instead, completely ignoring their armour. Overall, how you will want to play this is make sure to use your frontal armour, only show your side to fire once you know it's safe to, and try to steer clear of any spammers, since you do have a limited number of damage control parties, making emergency repair expert almost essential. Apart from that, Ismail should be the perfect ship for knocking out targets, absorbing fire and just having fun in ranked. The next battleship we'll look at is Issei. This can be a very influential ship since it's a hybrid, which has the benefits of being both a battleship and a carrier. It doesn't have massive guns, plus the armour does have some weak points, especially at the rear. However, the utility the torpedo planes provide more than makes up for that. When playing the ship, you are able to do lots of damage, since when you are engaging ships head-on, you can do the most damage, plus by having the torpedo bombers, you are able to give yourself easy broadside opportunities. One tactic I like to employ, especially at close to medium range, is attack what's usually a battleship with torpedo bombers, come in from the side and make them try to avoid the torpedoes. What this strategy achieves is guaranteed damage. If your target decides to try and avoid the torpedoes, you will probably only hit a couple. However, the price the enemy has to pay for it is giving you a broadside. This you then can do monstrous damage. If however your target doesn't try to avoid them, you can then hit most of your torpedoes, guaranteeing at least 10,000 damage, so either way you will hurt them. When it comes to other carriers, they shouldn't be too much of an issue either, since your great anti-air should be able to knock a good amount of planes out, and even more so if you are to spec for it. A couple of things you should watch out for however, is it's a ship that tolerates no overextension. The ship takes an age to reverse, by which time you'll have taken lots of damage, especially if your poorly armoured flight deck is targeted, and if you decide to turn around, you will find you won't get far with your low top speed. Plus, with awful rear firing angles, there's not much you can do to provide any return fire, so the same concept that I explained with West Virginia applies here too. Finally, for dealing with submarines, since there are already aircraft you can use, I'm unsure whether it'll be able to receive an airstrike as Issei wasn't available on the test server, so we'll have to see when the season starts. Now if you don't get any, your secondaries are pretty good, but the thing is most of them are located in the front, so if a submarine does decide to attack you from behind, you are going to be in trouble. The last battleship we'll look at is Warships, which is on this list partly because it's a personal favourite of mine, and because it's a decent ship. Before getting into the good points, we'll quickly discuss the bad. The first is speed. It's pretty slow at 23.5 knots, so Sierra Mike is essential here, and on top of that, the acceleration is rather slow, so it will take a while to get there. There is also the issue of armour, which does leave Warspite open to HE spam, which is further exacerbated by the slow top speed, making it hard to get away. Although it will take damage rather easily, there is the fact it comes with a rather good repair party, allowing it to recover almost a fifth of its health back from full penetration damage, so can easily mitigate HE spam. Plus, the damage control party consumable has a rather short cooldown of 60 seconds, so you won't need to wait long for putting out floods and fires if anything's permanent. Although the torpedo protection isn't the best, the turning circle is. Sitting at the 550 meters allows for tight turning, which with enough warning allows for moderately easy dodging of torpedoes, and when paired with the steering gears modification 1, means you can get the rudder shift time down to a mere 11.3 seconds. That choice will depend on what you want from the build, because instead you could go for the propulsion modification, which will bring the time to full speed down from 60 to 30 seconds. The thing about Warspite is it also has a good number of secondaries with a decent range. If you sport a full secondary build, you'll be able to fire around 7.5 kilometers, which I've found to be surprisingly effective, so warding off both destroyers and submarines will be made much easier from this. Although there are those benefits, a secondary build may not be optimal, however it can provide quite a lot of fun. In the next update, secondaries will be changing in their working, so let me know in the comments below if you want me to test them for you once the update drops, and I'll let you know how the secondaries perform on Warspite. Although Warspite doesn't have as many guns as other battleships at the same tier, they can still hurt. With 8 381mm guns, you'll be able to do lots of damage, especially to unsuspecting cruisers, but you will have a similar dilemma as described with Ismail, which is low overmatch values. One thing you do have is pretty good plunging fire, so longer range targets you'll find you may get some additional citadels that you wouldn't have done with other ships, so there is that additional benefit. As well as this, the high explosive is pretty good too. With a fire chance of 34%, if you are not having the best time with AP, then you'll certainly be able to burn your targets down with HE instead, but if you purely want to watch things burn, you may want to pick a different ship. As an overview, Warspite is a great premium ship that has stood the test of time, and should carry on doing so, including in this latest season of Ranked. With some dedication, you'll be able to rank out in no time whilst having quite a bit of fun. Finally, we will look at carriers. This class is multi-role, as they are ships that need to provide essential spotting information for the team, continually wear down the opponents with attacks, and defend your teammates with fighters. This class is certainly more based on preference for what type of player you are, since that will determine the targets you want to focus on. The first carrier we will be looking at today is the German premium Erich Löwenhardt. This is the carrier all destroyers will fear and do their best to avoid, because of how easily the high explosive bombers can knock them out. Since the latest changes to the rocket attacks, it's been made much easier for destroyers to avoid attacks, so more than ever this ship will be a great choice for knocking them out. If your main goal is to knock them out, allowing your team's destroyers to have uncontested control, then this will be the perfect ship for you. Apart from the bombers, you do also have torpedo and rocket planes, which are also relatively good. For the rocket planes, these are armour piercing, so won't be too effective against destroyers, however some of the lightly armoured cruisers will feel much more pain if you get a strike on them. As for the torpedo bombers, these are pretty good too, but are more to provide a supplementary amount of damage whilst your bombers are on cooldown, as the torpedo damage is very low, but they are very quick, so it's more effective. It's guaranteed damage of maybe 4000 if you hit 2, but if anything you'll just be hoping for a flooding instead, as that will provide you with more damage. There is also an option of going for a secondary build, which is more viable for German carriers. Honestly, I think you'd do this more for the meme, since most of the time, things getting that close will be destroyers. So if you wanted to counter them, your bombers would easily do that job, saving commander points that can be spent elsewhere. To sum this ship up, if you do have it, then you'll be able to make some really impactful plays and lead you to more victories. Next up, we are looking at Ark Royal, the premium British carrier. This ship had used to be very underpowered really, but since the commander skill rework is actually a pretty viable ship due to its survivability and good number of planes on deck. All the planes have their own good points, but the main focus is certainly on the high explosive and torpedo bombers. Starting things off, one thing we've not spoken about much with these carriers is their ability to knock out submarines. Since Ark Royal has a large spread of high explosive bombs, it's one of the best suited carriers for dealing with submarines, as it spreads an area with bombs, giving you the best chance to score a hit. If you've not got Ark Royal, the same concept should apply with Furious, the tech tree counterpart, but as well as submarines, the high explosive bombs will also be good for starting deck fires on larger and slower targets, such as battleships and heavy cruisers, which, when you are waiting for other planes, will provide a good source of additional damage. Moving on to the torpedoes, these are very good too. When you aim them in, they allow for very precise drops, since when the reticle is fully aimed, the torpedoes to come to somewhat of a point, meaning with practice you'll be able to reliably hit 2 or 3 hits per drop. The good thing about that is they do a pretty decent amount of damage too, so you'll be able to knock out a good chunk of health in a relatively short space of time, plus there's a good chance you'll get a flood or two as well. The rocket planes you will mainly want to use for spotting, going for destroyers, or as a reserve when you are out of torpedoes and bombers, as you'll then want to attack your target in hopes of setting a fire. To summarise, Ark Royal is another good pick in general, and will be perfect for whoever wants to hunt submarines in carriers. The last ship on the list is Ryujo. This is what you'd most likely pick if you didn't want to use high explosive bombers, as it means you are able to do massive damage to battleships and large cruisers when you score citadels, while still retaining the ability to deal with the destroyers since you have higher explosive rockets unlike Vaser. It's just an overall good carrier that's easy to access and with practice can perform very well. All the planes will perform, however regarding the rocket planes they may be a little problematic since they are very accurate and having aim a little bit off could hinder your chances of scoring hits on destroyers. Another thing you may want to do is spec for survivability since the planes do have somewhat low hit points. Now the way you could play this ship is start off a game using the rocket planes to spot any destroyers, and rather than using them as there's a good chance of you missing, you could keep them to just spot those destroyers and let your team fire on them instead. Once the destroyer you are focusing on has been knocked out or fallen back, you can then move on to larger targets. Here, you'll want to cycle between torpedo and AP bombers since they'll be doing the most damage. If possible, try and single out lone targets since they won't have the benefit of cumulative AA and so are easy kills, especially if your team is also focusing on them. When using the AP bombers, it's advisable to target larger ships since smaller ships there's a good chance you'll miss if they don't fill the aiming reticle. Plus, will be much more manoeuvrable, so there is also the chance of them avoiding them there too. Your best bet for those targets would instead be to use torpedoes and save the AP bombers for larger cruisers and battleships, where they'll have the most effect. To conclude, Ryujo is just an overall decent carrier which should perform really well. And so, that concludes the video. I hope you've found some use from this list, and if there are any ships that you think would do well, or aren't on this list, then feel free to share your own experiences or recommendations in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, then maybe consider checking out some of my other content on the end cards here, but with all that said, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one.